Dear guests, dear colleagues, we're extremely excited to welcome you today for our third webinar on Chinese disinformation. This is the project which was elaborated by the GMF Warsaw office. And of course, when we were thinking about this project, we didn't know that we will have to hold one of the webinars speaking on the war, on the Russian aggressions in Ukraine. But here we are. We all know what is happening. We're already full aware that we have two wars in fact happening. So one is physical war, the other one is information war. And we also would like to see what is happening in this dimension, in the information warfare dimension. And of course, needless to say that we realize that what is happening in China in terms of its information narratives is very much overlooked and maybe dismissed even. For this reason, today we brought these fantastic speakers to see what is happening there, to see how Chinese authorities and Chinese media are reflecting on the war conflict in Ukraine. What are they saying about Russia? What are they saying about Ukraine? What are they making of the conflict? And what do they think about the atrocities which are happening there? Please let me welcome our wonderful guests today. Our first guest is Justyna Szczudlik, who is Deputy Head of Research and China Analyst of the Polish Institute for International Affairs. Justyna, hello. We also have Bret Schafer, who is Senior Fellow and Head of the Information Manipulation Team of the Alliance for Security and Democracy. Hi, Bret. And last but not least, we have Tauno Tohk, who is a policy officer at the Strategic Communications and Information Analysis Division of the European External Action Service. Hi, Tauno. So as we see, we brought here speakers from different places, from different countries, so that we can really have as sophisticated, as full as possible picture. And as this project was funded by the grant of the US mission to NATO, we also would like to thank them. And we would like to start our conversation with a message from the US Ambassador to NATO, Julianne. Thank you. And then we'll be back and we'll continue our talk.
Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're sitting right now. Let me start by thanking the organizers, thanking the German Marshall Fund for putting together this important event on how Chinese disinformation is shaping the war in Ukraine. Sadly, I'm not able to join this event in real time, but I did want to record this message to relay how grateful I am that the organizers have put together this important event on this particular topic, which is really becoming a key foreign policy challenge for all of us, for many allies on both sides of the Atlantic. So there's no secret that the relationship between Russia and China, which in many ways started as a marriage of convenience, has been evolving in recent years. Most recently, we saw the very troubling statement that the two
Okay, dear guests, we will play the rest of the video later, so let's just assume it was a little teaser for our conversation today. And I would like to start our conversation with Justyna. Justyna, who is based in Warsaw, is overseeing what is happening in terms of Chinese narratives among Chinese officials. And for this reason, Justyna, I would really, first of all, like, of course, to thank you for finding time to be with us today. We all know that everybody is very busy these days. And also, I would like to ask you a few questions. So could you please give us a short introduction into your work, what you're doing or what you're seeing now? What is happening in terms of information space in China? what do Chinese officials say? What do they post? Do they specifically divide their narratives in terms of Europe? Is it Western Europe for them or Central Europe for them as a separate objectives for their narratives? How they project what is happening in Ukraine, and how do they call Russia and the war overall? We all know that in Russia it is criminal liability if anyone call this not a special operation but war. So what is China doing from their end in this regard? The floor is yours, Justyna. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. Thank you all of GMF staff for inviting me. It's my great pleasure. And as you said, I'm following mostly the official narrative given by Chinese leaders. I mean, Xi Jinping, Li Keqiang, Minister for Foreign Affairs Wang Yi, but also all these readouts that are published at the MFA website. I think that it is relevant because it tells us what China's official stance is, and what I'm following is mostly those readouts in Chinese, because I'm not focusing on the translated version, because the translations are not always accurate. And I think that the reason why China is also in Chinese language pretty weak and ambivalent is to say it openly, is trying to make us fall into Chinese trap and misunderstand what China is talking about. So I would like to focus both on disinformation and propaganda, and my general remark is that what China is doing right now is mirroring Russia's disinformation and propaganda. Before I start, because I would like to focus on the content of this narrative, which consists of disinformation propaganda, but before I start, let me say a few general remarks. First of all, China's narrative and discourse is very weak, nebulous, hazy, and China is doing it, and this is China's purpose, to create an image that China is neutral, does not take sides, and this is the reason why China neither condemns nor, let's say, supports Russia openly, or neither condemns Russia nor endorses Ukraine resistance and defense against Russia. And of course, let me also say a few words why China is doing so. I think that there are two trying to answer the question why China is trying to be so, let's say, neutral. I think that the very short answer is to eat a cake and have a cake. So China, on the one hand, would like to endorse Russia because shares with Moscow strategic interests, but on the other hand, does not want to damage its relations with the West, because West is important when it comes to economic issues, economic interdependence. So shortly, why China would like to endorse Russia? Because, of course, China shares with Moscow those two strategic goals. The first one is to undermine the Western or US-led international global order. Before the war, I don't know what China is thinking right now, but before the war, China was convinced that West is declining, the relevance of the West is declining, the East is going up. I don't know right now what China is talking about, the West and the like-minded countries and democratic countries, but the second goal is, of course, to keep the authoritarian or even totalitarian regimes alive. And of course, Russia is a natural partner in that sense. And the last two reasons, maybe more purely Chinese reasons, is this China's perception that its international position is deteriorating, as well as its security situation, as the US administration is trying to strengthen existing and build new alliances in Asia Pacific and deter China, and provide support for Taiwan in case of China's aggression. So of course, Russia is, let's say, a natural ally that China would like to cooperate with. And the last reason that China would like to distract US attention from the Indo-Pacific, wait and see, look what is going on in Ukraine, in order to prepare better for the future, let's say, tensions and crisis in Asia with the United States, China speaking. But despite this vagueness of the Chinese narrative, China is pretty open or explicit in its endorsement for Russia. I think that this is really significant difference when it comes to what to 2013, 2014, when Russia previous, let's say, war, aggression of Ukraine, when it comes to annexation of Crimea and war in Donbass. At that time, China was also pretty ambivalent and nebulous, but at that time did not mention Russia openly. So now very shortly and quickly, I would like to have a look what China is talking about Ukraine, Russia, West, and war. I think it's very interesting because it tells us about real China's perception of the war, but also the perception of Central and Eastern Europe and Ukraine as well. So first of all, China is talking about Ukraine. China refrains from mentioning Ukraine as a country or Ukraine as such. To some extent, I think that China is questioning Ukraine's statehood, because what China is talking about Ukraine is Ukraine issue, Ukraine problem, Ukraine situation, Ukraine crisis, Ukraine conflict. There is no Ukraine full stop, or Ukraine does something as a country. So this is the first point. The second point is that, to be frank, there is no China's explicit open statement that it respects sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of Ukraine. China very often says that sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of all countries should be respected, should be maintained, full stop. So China does not mention Ukraine, but very often the following sentence is about Russia and Russia's legitimate security concerns. And the third point is that there is no information from the Chinese side that Ukraine is a victim of aggression. So in my understanding, this shows us that to some extent, Ukraine is not perceived as a sovereign, independent country. I think, because I'm also doing some research recently about China's perception of CEE countries, Central and East European countries, that we as a region are perceived as, to some extent, dependent on others, on the United States, let's say, those countries that are in the EU and NATO, and under the influence of Russia as a sphere of influence when it comes to those countries that are not NATO and EU members. Point number two, what China is talking about Russia is a completely different story. Russia is being mentioned openly as a country many times, and as I said, it is a difference comparing to the 2013-2014. Chinese officials very often say that we should take into account Russia's legitimate security concerns. Also, China mirroring and to some extent amplifying some kind of Russia-led political concepts or phrases. Of course, the most important one and the most telling is the opposition to further enlargement or even expansion of NATO. It is a narrative that NATO is a Cold War organization. It is said that there is a process of unrestricted eastward expansion of NATO, and it is also said, but Chinese officials, as far as I remember, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, that there was a commitment made by NATO that they would not be enlarged, which is not true. Also, there is a kind of sentences that calling or some kind of appealing to build a balanced and effective security mechanism or system in Europe, which means that China, talking exactly emulating Russian narrative to change the security architecture in Europe. It is like to revise the security architecture in Europe, what is really scary for us as Central European countries. The next issue, I think, is very interesting, that China is very often, and it is a new kind of a narrative that started since this year, that China is using in its own official discourse, a narrative, this kind of a statement or phrase, which is called principle of indivisibility of security. This is in that sense, I think it's a Russian-led concept. Of course, I know that this is a kind of an idea that is written in many documents of the Organization for Security of Cooperation in Europe, but it is reference to Minister Lavrov's letter that was sent to Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe on the 1st of February, which is in fact appeal to change the security system in Europe. And it is really interesting because I check it. This phrase is in Chinese internet and in Chinese discourse. Is visible this year. In previous years, in previous months, you cannot find this kind of let's say, sentence and phrase. It's Russia-led. It's emulating or mirroring Russia's Latin narrative. And of course, what China is doing is also China amplifies fake news, like the example of US-led labs in Ukraine working on a biological weapon. And it's not only the discourse given by media, but also it was said many times by Chinese MFA spokesperson. And also the issue about massacre in Bucha yesterday was the first press conference after disinformation, because there was a few days off in Chinese MFA because of Qimingjie festival in China. So yesterday it was said. And it's a little bit different with Russian narrative, that China admits that those bodies are bodies, not actors, as Russia says. But what China is talking about is that we should the calls for investigation in order to find out who is responsible for this massacre. And what China is talking about is all parties should be restrained and avoid groundless accusations. And of course, China is against sanctions on Russia, and it is also, when it comes to China-Russia relations, they are described as, sorry for that bizarre statement, that friendship between our nation is rock solid, our relations contribute to the world peace and development, and recently after one Lavrov meeting the last week, it is said that China-Russia relations have ensured the right direction, have withstood the test of changing international situation, and there is a stronger determination of developed ties. And the last 2 points, what China is talking about the West, of course, there's some hints, pretty explicit hints, that the West, mostly NATO and the US, is responsible for the situation in Ukraine, not Russia. When it comes to the war, of course, China is trying to use different notions, but not war. Is trying to do not use phrase war and invasion. China is mostly talking about the conflict, fighting, dispute, this kind of issues, and there is no any examples of using this phrase of invasion, even without Russia, just invasion. No. And the last point, if there is any change in Chinese narrative in the last few weeks, bearing in mind that there were two important events. I mean, Xi Jinping-Biden video call in March, 18th of March, and also last week EU-China summit, and it was a huge pressure from US and the EU on China. I think, yes, there is a slight change, mostly when it comes to the topics, because China is under unprecedented pressure and is becoming aware that the war is detrimental for its international image and may have negative economic consequences. And it is very important because China is just before the Party Congress, and Xi Jinping would like to prolong its leadership to the third term. So what China is right now focusing on, some new elements. First of all, the focus on humanitarian issues, which is connected with this image, China's image. Focus on that all the parties should respect international humanitarian law. There's calls for ceasefire, to open humanitarian corridors, but of course China still does not say that Russia is the aggressor. The second topic is focus on economic issues, but mostly on sanctions, and it is a criticism of imposing sanctions on Russia, and I think that it is a signal that China is really afraid of economic consequences and is afraid of potential sanctions that could be imposed on China by the US and the EU if China decides to provide Russia with the material support. So I will stop here, and I'm open for the question in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Justyna, thank you so much for such a proliferant introduction. I think that we're going to have many more questions come to your introductions. At this moment, dear guests, I would like us to listen to the rest of the introduction by the US Ambassador to NATO, Julianne. And in the meantime, please let me kindly remind you that you can use Q&A button for your questions. So we will be, of course, collecting them and answering them in the end of our discussion. And I've already seen questions that some people have been asking whether this will be recorded and posted. Yes, it is being recorded, and it will be posted on GMF YouTube channel. So let's get back to our introduction by Ambassador Julianne. Thank you.
A troubling statement that the two countries issued just weeks before Russia's war in Ukraine, where the two came together and did a couple of things that personally I find quite troubling. One, we heard them talk about the fact that there's no limit to this relationship, which really lays out a higher ambition in terms of where they want to take this partnership. But I also found the fact that they started talking about NATO in particular and aligning their positions against NATO's open door policy as a troubling sign that we're seeing even more convergence between these two countries and how their relationship continues to evolve and in many ways become strengthened. They essentially share the same vision right now for a global order that looks very different than the global order that the West, that Europe and North America and other democratic allies talk about around the world. We're seeing them both promote an alternative, a different system to the democratic systems that we represent. And we're also finding that increasingly these two nations are learning from each other. They're observing the ways in which they rely on certain hybrid tactics and looking for ways that they can seize on some of those lessons and strengthen their kind of joint toolbox in countering some of the positions that the West is putting forward on a variety of subjects. And when it comes to learning and one of their favorite tools in their toolkits, it really brings us to today's topic, which is the subject of disinformation. Now, on disinformation as it relates to Ukraine, what's been interesting is to watch the Chinese and how their public statements seem to be an attempt to maintain some sort of neutral position as it relates to the war in Ukraine. But if you dig a little bit deeper and you look at what Chinese state media is actually saying about the war, you find very quickly that the Chinese are in many ways mirroring the Russian messages that are coming out of Moscow by Russian officials. For example, the Russians, as you all well know, frequently refer to the war as a special military operation. That's a term and that's language that we see the Chinese replicating on their end. They're also frequently repeating Russian state media stories calling into question American motives, our commitment, and our ability to defend our partners and allies around the world. And again, the fact that you see the mirroring between those two countries, to me, is an increasingly troubling sign about where this relationship is headed. I also wanted to mention that just recently there was a CNN study some of you may have seen that actually reviewed thousands of social media posts from Chinese state media on Weibo during the first 8 days of the war in Ukraine. And it found that of the 300 most shared posts, those that get over 1,000 likes or so, About half of those were pro-Russian or from Russian officials. Now, this is consistent with, again, an ongoing pattern where we're seeing these two countries mirror their messages. We've seen it in other areas. We've seen it as it relates to events in Hong Kong. We saw it as it related to the pandemic, and certainly as they describe their perceived U.S. role in color revolutions that are undertaken to push back against authoritarian regimes. Now, we see that mirroring doesn't just apply to Chinese language posting or media, but actually it spills over into their English language propaganda as well. And we've seen that, for example, on Twitter and in many cases and other social media platforms. So obviously this is a relationship that's growing, it's evolving, and all of us, I believe, find many parts of this evolving relationship to be quite troubling. In terms of the way forward, I mean, I think this will be an ongoing challenge for the transatlantic partners. We're going to have to do a better job in enhancing our own strategic communications. We're going to have to build up our own resilience to these types of efforts in terms of their use of disinformation. We're going to have to share information with each other more frequently and regularly. And lastly, in many ways, we have to get out ahead of some of these narratives that we know are coming. We saw that in the lead up to the war in Ukraine, where the United States actually called out what we believed could have been a false flag operation to use shared intelligence to reveal some of their plans in advance. And I think those types of tactics, as they're used by the West, can be helpful in getting out ahead of anticipated narratives that either Russia or the Chinese are going to be promoting. So let me just close by saying, again, I'm sorry I can't join you in real time, but congratulations to the organizers. This is a very important event to be undertaking in this moment. And I look forward to hearing from the organizers about some of the results and insights that came from this event. Thank you again.
Dear guests, we're back. I think that it was fantastic that Ambassador Smith was able to provide us with this speech, because I think that we've heard a lot of interesting insights, which of course we're going to discuss now. Some of those details and moments mentioned by Ambassador Smith, I think are indeed very disturbing and worrying. And for this reason, I would like to turn to Bret and to ask you whether you see the same in terms of the statistics which you as a head and of the manipulation team, but also as a whole Alliance for Security and Democracy have been looking into during last 40 days. And once again, I would also like to thank you for great work you are doing on monitoring disinformation narratives and what is happening in China, Iran, and Russia. Over to you, Bret. Thank you.
Thanks, Veronica. So just to give you a little bit of background about what we do at ASD, we have a tool called Hamilton 2.0. We also have a dashboard called the War in Ukraine dashboard. It essentially aggregates all of the outputs across Twitter, YouTube, state-sponsored websites, MFA briefings. We have some CrowdTangle Facebook data as well. But we look at sort of Russian officials, Chinese officials, and Iranian officials, as well as state media and state-affiliated personalities. So it's a way to kind of see a holistic view of what these governments are pushing, both through diplomatic channels, but also obviously through their state media channels as well. So when you look at China and Russia's alignment, if you kind of go back to 2021, the areas where we saw significant convergence tended to be around sort of anti-American, anti-Western narratives. I mean, the binding agent between the two really is anti-Americanism. So where we saw significant alignment from Russia and China tended to be on these bigger picture sort of meta issues about America's role in the war, but also attacking the US for its many flaws. So it would attack the US for its sort of style of democracy, for everything we saw around January 6th, for issues with minorities. That's where we tended to see really striking similarities between the messaging coming out of Russia and China, but there wasn't so much backing each other's specific narratives at times, for sure. But you wouldn't see Russia necessarily weigh in heavily on Taiwan, for example. And you didn't see China weigh in heavily on Ukraine prior to February 2022. And you saw a little bit in the ramp up to the war, but not a significant amount. So what we've seen since the war has started has been a continuation of that, of course. Justyna mentioned this, as well as Ambassador Smith. There's been clearly a continuation of this sort of anti-NATO rhetoric. Last week, or I guess maybe 2 weeks ago, one of the top 3 hashtags and key phrases used by Chinese officials was NATO. And almost all of that content was negative. And it was tied to the 23rd anniversary of the NATO bombing of Belgrade, using that as sort of a whataboutism argument of, okay, so now NATO cares about human rights, look what they did in the past. I mean, the kind of style that we've seen repeatedly over the last 2-3 years. So nothing particularly new there. What has been new has been China leaning into, I would say, sort of distinctly pro-Kremlin narratives. So particularly around neo-Nazis in Ukraine, which is something we did not see in 2021. We really only had in our entire data set, maybe 2-3 tweets coming from official Chinese accounts that connected Nazism to Ukraine. Since February, that's about 160. So there's clearly been an escalation to mirror some of Russian talking points about the threat of Nazis in Ukraine. Then, of course, as Justyna also mentioned, this idea of bioweapons, that all ties back to the Chinese disinformation campaign run around COVID and sort of saying that this was all launched out of Fort Detrick. So there's mutually beneficial parts of that narrative, but there's also very distinctly sort of pro-Russian, in some cases, kind of American far-right conspiratorial narratives that have leaked into Chinese rhetoric. So around like Hunter Biden, for example, having a role in the bioweapons program in Ukraine. We've seen Chinese officials, the Chinese consul in Belfast, who retweeted a post essentially saying Zelensky is in hiding at the US embassy in Poland, and all of his video messages are sort of green screened. I mean, really sort of kind of crazy fringe conspiratorial things. Where they haven't quite mirrored Russia has been around Bucha, and particularly around some of the claims that atrocities we're seeing have been staged. Now, they have not gone so far as to criticize Russia. As Justyna also mentioned, they have taken the sort of position that these things need to be investigated. So they've stopped short of criticizing Russia, but they've also stopped short of amplifying these claims that this is just the result of crisis actors and Ukrainian or American provocations. Why I think this is important is, of course, across the EU, there's been a Russian state media ban. So we have clearly seen in the metrics a huge decline in the engagement numbers, the interaction numbers, and even the postings coming out of Russian state media outlets on the European continent. I mean, at least a 50% decline in most countries. So they're obviously looking for messengers to fill that void. Some of the messengers have been Russian diplomats and Russian government officials and Russian embassy accounts. So sort of oddly, for many years, we talked about China adopting kind of the Kremlin playbook in terms of messaging on social media. We're seeing the Kremlin kind of adopting the Chinese playbook of really using their diplomats and embassy accounts as the sort of front line of their messaging campaign. But also, of course, when you have Chinese state media, which is definitely not as big and as popular on the European continent as Russian state media was, but it's significant. Adopting these same narratives, that's another way to push pro-Kremlin narratives into the information space. And beyond just the narratives, we've also seen them leaning into or giving a platform to former RT and Sputnik pundits, commentators, hosts. George Galloway, for example, who's a former UK parliamentarian, but has been on RT and Sputnik for years and years and years. His videos are being sort of directly published by Global Times. He was retweeted in the last week 10 times by Chinese officials. We saw another guy by the name of Lee Camp, who used to be on RT America. is being reposted by Chinese state media. So we're seeing now not just that the narratives are being picked up, we're also seeing the expert contributors, the commentators, the pundits also finding their way into Chinese state media. So there's been just a broad sort of convergence of narratives, but tactics and of personalities that we've seen over the past couple months. And I will stop there because I know Tauno's also going to cover sort of Chinese state media, so I don't want to hit all of the talking points there, and look forward to your questions.
Bret, thank you so much. And indeed, what you're saying is very much, I think, eye-opening for a lot of our audience who, of course, I'm sure is very much following the Russian narratives and what is coming out from Kremlin, but didn't know about this, what is actually happening in terms of the Chinese narratives and how they echo Kremlin ones, how they don't, where is the dividing line there. And as during the last days, we, of course, are seeing more and more atrocities coming out. Of course, it will be, I think, very important to see which of these narratives China will be echoing and which they will be transforming into something which would serve them better. So I would really encourage all of us, I guess, to stay tuned and to see what is happening in this regard. And of course, at this point, I would like to ask Tauno a few questions which have been boiling, I think, for all of us during all these days. Do you, Tauno, agree with this actually affect the ban on certain media cost in the narratives you're seeing in Europe? Whether how specifically European audience you think is pursuing what is happening in terms of Chinese narratives, and can you perhaps also give us a little bit of statistics? I know that you versus Disinfo are doing a great job in shedding some light on what is happening, and I would probably ask you also to share maybe a few insights from your recent observations. Thank you. The floor is yours. Over to you, Tauno.
Thank you, Veronica, and of course it's very difficult to be a speaker after two such comprehensive and good speakers. But thanks for the questions, and also a little bit of a background on what we do. So I'm indeed part of a team, or the division that has been dealing with pro-Kremlin disinformation for several years now, and now we are looking also at some emerging actors like China, and then my focus with a few other colleagues is on Chinese messaging and activities, and Chinese information manipulation. And I think maybe indeed starting your questions, as far as I know, in terms of statistics and EU versus Disinfo and the database that collects disinformation examples, does it for pro-Kremlin media. So there we have already over, I don't know the latest exact number, but definitely over 13,000 cases of pro-Kremlin disinformation that has been collected over the past years. So the sample is quite large. But I am not the Russia expert myself, so I can only kind of, I'll use this as a starting point, and when it comes to also what we have observed before the Ukraine war. So as Bret also said, that there have been also alignments between what Russian state media and channels are saying and what Chinese state media and channels have been saying, and indeed biolabs as one of the conspiracy theories of pro-Kremlin, familiar pro-Kremlin narratives was picked up by Chinese officials and then Chinese media in the beginning of COVID. And there was some mutual amplification also and ping pong between Russia's MFA spokesperson saying something, then that being referred to by Chinese Julianne, and then again that being referred to again as by the Russian people, so as to kind of also a little bit give the message that there is international concern regarding the biolabs, which is actually, which is already an embedded part of this conspiracy narrative nowadays, that there needs to be transparency about these alleged military labs and so on and so on. But this was not the only case. When there were the human rights sanctions on Xinjiang, then that was one case where we also saw it the other way. It was Russian state media supporting Chinese arguments and denials of any human rights violations happening in Xinjiang. And also some parallel messaging last year during the Afghanistan crisis, where both actors used this to promote the message that the West or US is not the trustworthy partner either in Ukraine or in Taiwan. So in that sense, kind of this occasional convergence or alignment is not new. But of course, the situation currently with Ukraine, it is completely new in the sense that since Russia is the cause and part of this exact crisis and well, military aggression, then theoretically it should all lead back to Russia. But when looking at, as Bret also I think said, looking at Chinese media, Chinese overseas media, then Russia is not necessarily always prominent, in the sense that while of course the Ukraine after the Olympics finished, which was until the Olympics happened, it was kind of the main topics the main topic in Chinese media that we saw. But as after Olympics, Ukraine, the war in Ukraine has been constantly the top topic covered by Chinese media. But having said this, when it comes to Russia's role in the crisis and coverage of Russia, it is conspicuously absent often. That while indeed, as was mentioned, that there are calls for peace, there are calls for parties to de-escalate, there are mentions of humanitarian issues or military activities, it almost never leads back to Russia's activities. And I think when looking at if looking at only at Chinese media for the Russia's military aggression in Ukraine, you would actually get the impression that it's a NATO military aggression against Russia. And I think this is this already started before the invasion, where Western scaremongering and warmongering were mostly called out, and all NATO troops positionings in the neighboring countries of Ukraine were very reported in a very detailed way, but usually without mentioning of Russia's presence of Russia's over 100,000 troops on the other side of Ukraine. And after as I said, after the invasion, there has been a little mention of Russia's military activity, and Russian military invasion is usually not mentioned, except we see that there is CGTN is sometimes diverging from other Chinese media in kind of also giving some platform to other to Ukrainian officials and so on, but in the end, it's still mostly Russian sources or very prominently Russian sources that are used to cover the crisis, and also giving a prominent platform to Russian channels, and maybe one more. So I think the NATO, anti-NATO, anti-West narratives, these were also, I think, mentioned. So I'm basically repeating everything what was said already. But this is one of the defining things about also Chinese coverage of the Ukraine crisis, that it's the NATO and the West that is to be blamed for the war, and then Russia was the party that was forced to act. It was pushed into a corner, and it did not have a choice anymore when it came to Ukraine. And now we also see that there is kind of that there are occasional parallels drawn to the Indo-Pacific and allegations that Ukraine is just a taste of what will come in the Indo-Pacific region, and of course Taiwan is also one of the kind of recurring topics when it comes to Chinese coverage of the crisis, trying to not draw parallels between Taiwan and Ukraine, saying that with Taiwan it's a totally different case, and it's of course a Chinese internal matter, and so on and so on. And I would actually stop here because I would basically continue repeating what was said already, but I'm happy to also answer all questions that you might have.
Tauno, thank you so much for your input, and in order not to make you feel that you're a little bit and as an outsider of our discussion, I would actually like to pull up a few what you have said with a few questions coming from my side. First of all, what was the reaction on EU-China summit in the media, in the Chinese media? What were you saying? Whether you see that there is a different narrative for domestic Chinese audience, perhaps in media, and for foreign audience? This is my second question. And my third question is that how were Chinese media and state outlets, how they were commenting on multiple reports coming from Western media and Western diplomatic channels on Russia's build-up on Ukraine's around Ukraine territory? So were they dismissing them? Were they saying it's fake? Or were they saying that this is NATO provoking Russia to do this? What did you see in your research when it was just the beginning of it? I think it would be important so that we can compare the dynamics.
Yes, I think when it comes to the EU-China summit, it's still a little bit developing, but looking at also what has been said so far from the EU side, for example, and what has been reported in the Chinese media, then the Chinese original portrayal was, of course, more positive than from the EU side. So more towards the business as usual. Now on the kind of the differences between Chinese domestic and the rest of the world. This is a very good question, actually, because while in our work we mostly follow what China does towards the rest of the world, we understand and have seen reporting that the Russian disinformation narratives, for example, and Russian positions are much more prominent when it comes to the Chinese domestic space than, for example, in Chinese overseas media, let's say so, or state-controlled overseas media. But there actually also it is important probably to and then maybe there's sometimes the question of whether they have been successful or whether it has been effective in the sense of and of course effectiveness of communication activities, it's always very difficult, and information manipulation activities, it's always very difficult to measure. This is kind of one of the $1 million or €1 million questions. But what we can, but of course what I think we can see from the media picture in the West and in the developed countries, we can say for sure that they have not been successful, neither Russia or China, at least in the mainstream public media. But the question is and also the public opinion surveys, for example, Pew Institute's survey about attitudes towards China have shown that the attitudes towards China over the past few years have been constantly declining. So in that sense, one can say that China maybe has not been successful. But the question there is, of course, are we in the West the main target groups of Chinese communication, or whether these main targets are located elsewhere? and especially also if you look at some of the messaging, especially when it comes to, for example, democracy. So talking a little bit beyond Ukraine, when it comes to the democracy and also general human rights norms and so on, then it seems that that indeed the main kind of part of communications is indeed directed elsewhere. Now, when it comes to the buildup of Chinese, of Russian troops on Ukraine borders, of course, it was originally what we saw. It was that it was indeed dismissed as Western fear mongering, that of course, and also actually also as Western disinformation often. So it was reported as something that is not really happening, and it's rather the as I also referred before, that showing the relatively small kind of military activities by NATO compared to what Russia was doing. So the focus was always on how the West is somehow increasing and militarily building up rather than Russia. So it was indeed, I think, yeah, it was clearly from the start. The blame was put on the West and NATO.
Thank you so much. This is very, very, very useful. Tauno, thank you very much. My next question would be to Justyna. So having heard all of this, what do you think? What are the purposes of this kind of behavior of the Chinese officials and Chinese media and coming up with this sort of narratives? I'm asking this also because I'm mainly, of course, working with Eastern European media space, and I remember how there were so many jokes, kind of bad jokes, of course, when the war started, that, oh, now China will be very happy because they can, even, I don't know, invade some Russian territory. That's what the internet was joking about. So many people were thinking that China would actually start some, perhaps, rivalry with Russia over certain narratives, or so that it can serve their own interests. So why do you think they're doing what they're doing now, China, and what do you think is their, I would say, short-term and maybe long-term vision, how they should behave with the NATO in this regard? Would you be able to elaborate on that? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Veronica, for this question. About the China's purpose of this, let's say narrative, and the fact that China endorses Russia. I think that first of all, as it was mentioned by Bret and Tauno, that the China's endorsement for Russia is not started since February 24, but it was pretty long term, let's say, alignment or even alliance. So when we go back to the 4th of February, when Putin went to Beijing and met with Xi Jinping, and then two countries issued a joint statement, which was really interesting, and I think it's a really breakthrough when it comes to those relations, about its limitless friendship. And I think that at that time, Xi Jinping was informed about Putin's plan to assault the Ukraine. Of course, he was informed that it would be some kind of very short war, that because Russian army is very powerful, and Ukrainians will probably welcome Russian army with flowers and so on. So in that sense, I don't want to say that Putin purposely played Xi Jinping, but when Xi Jinping decided to sign this kind of very interesting, really is important when it comes to those alignment document. So he could not right now change his mind. He could not change the narrative, but I'm almost sure that China is really unhappy looking what is going on in Ukraine right now, especially looking at this process of shelling and bombing civilians, hospitals, kids, children, infants, pregnant women. But Xi Jinping could not change in a very open manner his policy. He does not want to lose face, especially bearing in mind that the party congress is approaching. And of course, I think that what China is trying to do right now is to show us as a, let's say, democratic world that is changing a little bit this narrative and probably will not provide Russia with the material support. But of course, still, Russia is an important, let's say, partner because, especially right now, as it was said in many countries, also in Central European countries, the perception of China is really negative. It's a change in the last 2-3 years. So China is aware that China needs, let's say, a political friend, and Russia still is a political friend. As it was said, of course, the main purpose is this anti-Americanism, is this glue that makes those countries, let's say, allies. But of course, I could not imagine that after the summit, the meeting with Biden, China will decide to openly support Russia with military equipment and even in economic assistance. And if I may just also a few words about the purpose of this disinformation. To be frank, I think that mostly it is for domestic reasons and for domestic consumption because of the huge domestic problems in China when it comes to economy mostly. And when it comes also to your question to Tauno about the EU-China summit, let me say very briefly 2 sentences about Chinese readouts after this summit, because I think it's extremely interesting. Because China tried to, let's say, do not say about the atmosphere, that atmosphere was very tough, unfriendly, because there was a kind of warnings from the EU side. And but when it looks at when we read this readout, the last paragraph is about economy, and I think it's pretty emotional when it comes to China, because China is really afraid of potential sanctions that are right now the EU and US impose on Russia, and of course is really afraid of potential sanctions on China. So I think that there is let's say, a debate within the Communist Party what to do with this huge problem. So I do hope that this kind of pressure from the EU, from the United States, will work. And I do not expect the change in a narrative and some political support, but I do hope that China will think twice whether it is in China's interest to provide material support for Russia.
Thank you so much, Justyna. I will just start addressing our questions, which we have been collecting so far, and kind of merge them with my questions, which still keep popping up, because what all of you, Bret and Tauno, are saying is extremely interesting. I think it's important. So I wanted to ask you actually whether you think there is the red line of how much actually China can support Russia also in terms of its information campaigns. And also it's a question to all of you, to all our you distinguished speakers, also to Bret and Tauno. Do you see any contesting, let's say, narratives coming from Chinese dissidents, oppositional circles, whether there is anything which we can say as it is in Russia, right? Also, there is a group of people who who go against the authorities and step up and say the truth about war is war and invasion, and there are atrocities and so on. Over to you, Justyna.
Okay, so about the red lines, I mean the red lines from the, let's say, Russian side, what Russia, in what case China could change its support, what Russia, well, maybe in another way. I think that the red line when it comes to Russia's activities, let's say, or Russian invasion of Ukraine is, I think, and it was said, I think, by the EU officials yesterday or 2 days ago, is the use of mass destruction weapons by Russia in Ukraine. I think that really right now it's a huge headache in Beijing, as Beijing is looking at the situation in Ukraine and the civilian casualties, atrocities in Bucha and in other countries, and there's no destruction of the infrastructure. So I think that, and it, as also Bret admitted, that in case of massacre in Bucha, China acknowledges that there was massacre, those peoples are their peoples, and does not want to follow the Russian narrative that there is a kind of a, let's say, actors, this stage and so on. I think that we can see that we are, let's say, we are coming closer to the red line. I do hope that Russia will not use those kind of weapons, but I think that it is a kind of a red line that China probably will not cross.
Bret, what do you think, and what have you noticed? So
I would agree with that. I think we're at a sort of hazy red line already with Bucha. The question I think that remains open is what actually happens if Russia crosses the red line. Now, I think we've seen with Bucha that China is not willing to throw its support behind the killings of civilians. Certainly don't think they would support Russia's use of chemical weapons, obviously. But the extent that they would actually maybe jump over to the other side of the barricades and really message aggressively against China, I'm not so sure about. I think chemical weapons maybe would almost require China to put out a statement against that kind of activity. But clearly we've seen with Bucha that has not pushed China to actually aggressively message against Russia. All it's done is essentially put them on the sidelines saying, this should be investigated. We're not going to back Russia's narrative here, but we're also not going to back the Western narrative. But I think Justyna is right that chemical weapons, I can't imagine that China could just stay silent on that. I think that would put them in an incredibly difficult position.
And in terms of contested narratives, I was asking, have you seen any kind of oppositional or alternative narratives?
To be honest, we don't track the sort of opposition as systematically as we do the official government narrative. So Tauno may be better positioned, but I just don't have the evidence.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Bret. And you, Justyna, have you heard?
Veronica, you are muted.
Yes, I see. Have you heard of anything like this, or have you seen any of such, I don't know, alternative or, let's say, narratives coming from Chinese dissidents or Chinese opposition in regards to what is happening in Ukraine?
No, because I'm following the official narrative, so I could not answer your question. Sorry.
Maybe this will be a topic for our next meeting. Let's see. And Tauno, what can you say in terms of red?
And if I may, to be frank, nowadays in China, I think it would be very difficult to have an access to these opposition, let's say, or dissidents. And if I may, for now, for the think tankers right now, it's really difficult even to have some contacts with the experts from the state think tanks. They're pretty afraid of to meet with us and to talk even some kind of an official narrative. So I think it would be difficult very much. It's very difficult to reach those dissidents or the people that you have different, let's say, different assessment of what is going on in Ukraine.
And you think they won't even be willing to use social media if, let's say, they live abroad or anything like this?
Yeah, probably, yeah. Living abroad, yes, but I think that I'm honest, it's very difficult to have an access right now to the Chinese experts in China. They are working in some kind of public think tanks, and just to meet with them and to talk, just generally speaking, even before the war, during this, in the last two years since the pandemic especially, and the war for diplomacy, it's not very easy to have an access and to have a frank discussion, you know, of course, using Zoom, because right now, because of especially the pandemic that is still ongoing in China, even some closed meetings, it's very, very difficult because they are, I think, afraid of some contacts with the foreigners.
Thank you so much. I think it's very important observation also for all of us to understand just a general situation with information, access to information, and with the freedom of speech in China, which I think is very important. Tauno, so what would be your input and observations?
Yes, I think Justyna and Bret made the main points. Maybe just to add in the sense that also looking at how, for example, conspiracy theories travel even in our societies, you don't necessarily need to be in a totally controlled information environment to believe kind of something very different than might be the truth. And then adding to this that as we all know and as if well documented, China is a very well and very thoroughly controlled information environment. So they're probably, that already creates certain limits to kind of what other kind of how the let's say the truth or narratives that go against the Chinese official ones, how far they can travel in this society. We know that we have heard that for example, some of Ukraine embassy's social media posts have received some traction on Weibo, for example. And I think there have been reports also about some initiatives of kind of also translating some materials into Chinese. But yeah, so not kind of also, this is not also something that we track on a daily basis. And on the red lines, I think also looking at now, I think the red lines is probably, it is a political question and a political decision in the sense, but also looking at how Chinese media has covered the war and the military aggression up to now, we see that they have not picked up all of Russia's disinformation narratives, for example. You have much larger variety of those conspiracy theories and all kinds of disinformation narratives in Chinese, in Russian media than Chinese media. It is probably that the Chinese channels pick up those that are somehow also aligned with the longer term communications goals of China.
So much. I will just ask all of your last question from my side, and then I will start collecting more questions from our audience. And I have a request also to our audience, please, if you could not put your questions which are too long, it would be fantastic, because I'm afraid we won't have time, just all of us, to read them out. What did you see in your research, Justyna, Bret, and Tauno, in terms of recent and of course growing sanctions over Western countries and the US and Canada and Australia and so on against Russia? How was this reflected in your specific areas in your data? And do you believe that also China will be, of course, using this now economic vulnerability, I would say, of Russia to promote their own goods? Because I think this is what we're already seeing, that a lot of Russians are saying, oh, it's okay, we don't need all these goods coming from Western Europe, from US. We will be using Chinese services, Chinese goods, even maybe Chinese social media. So would you somehow comment on on this? Thank you. Justyna, over to you. I'm mindful of time that you will have to leave,
Yeah.
sharp.
So you're asking about the sanctions and if China could replace those, let's say, goods that are now prohibited from well, to be honest, this is the huge question, because it could mean that China is circumventing the sanctions and would like to, let's say, provide Russia with the material support. So I think, well, it depends, because it was said after the summit, it was Reuters informed, because it was not in a Chinese readouts and it was not said in a Chinese MFA website, that one of the Chinese officials said that China does not want to circumvent the sanctions. So on the one hand, but on the other hand, is committed or would like to have normal, let's say, economic cooperation with Russia. So this is the question, what this exactly means. But during the summit, EU-China summit, but also during the meeting, the video call between Biden and Xi Jinping, both US and EU warned China that the biggest, let's say, the red line from our side is that China could not help materially Russia. So this is the question. There are some signals that, let's say, it was a few weeks ago that China, that Russia asked China for some help in some kind of spare parts for planes, and China said no. There's also the information that China does not want to have some new contracts when it comes to some oil and other issues. So I think that there's some signals that, or maybe China would like to send the signals openly, publicly, that does not want to support Russia. But I could imagine that this kind of, let's say, normal economic cooperation is still ongoing. And it was said openly during the parliamentary session in the beginning of March. It was the press conference by Minister of Foreign Affairs. It is normal situation that on the sidelines of the parliamentary session, why Minister of Foreign Affairs has press conference, and it was said openly that we would like, China would like to have normal economic cooperation with Russia. So it's to sum up, it's really difficult to say if this normal economic cooperation means circumventing sanctions or just to have this normal economic cooperation.
Thank you, Justyna. I would like to switch to Bret, but also, Bret, I have a question for you as the only American here. You'll have to, I think, answer a question regarding American far right, and whether you see that they somehow, in your research, whether they embrace any of China's narrative of the war in Ukraine. Maybe you know anything like this. I know that it's not your specific topic, but perhaps just generally you see anything like this. Thank you.
Yeah, so I can answer that question first. So I wouldn't say the US far right is adopting Chinese narratives, because they would actively avoid being seen as promoting China. They are adopting Russian narratives, which of course have become Chinese narratives. So in a way, yes, but they would distance themselves in every way possible from saying that they are sort of adopting or mirroring Chinese talking points. But we've seen a significant amount of convergence with sort of US, not even far right, I mean, some mainstream right personalities adopting sort of pro-Russian narratives about the war. I mean, sort of most influentially, probably Tucker Carlson on Fox has brought on several pundits who have also sort of mirrored Russian talking points about the war. And then we've, of course, seen this sort of fusion of two different conspiracy theories kind of melding into one, or sort of narratives of choice. So, of course, Hunter Biden has been an obsession of the American right for several years. And so the ability to attach him to the Ukraine bioweapons conspiracy theory made it this sort of reinforcing mechanism where it was beneficial for Russia, it was beneficial for the right. And you saw it sort of pinball back and forth between state media from Russia and sort of right-leaning media in the US. So there's a significant amount of alignment with a part of the right-wing ecosystem. Not all. I mean, there's still pretty much bipartisan support in the US against Russia. So I want to be clear on that this is not, I think, indicative of sort of the mainstream Republican position on the war. But if you look at the sort of fringier US political figures like Madison Cawthorn and Marjorie Taylor Greene, who've called Zelensky a thug and that the Ukraine is so corrupt. Obviously, we've seen their amplification of narratives that are beneficial for Russia. So they appear on Russian state television. I mean, not personally, but their comments appear on Russian state television. So to the first question then, I guess, about sanctions, there has been a significant amount of coverage of sanctions from Chinese state media, and the vast majority of it is negative. So we're tracking since the start of the war 3,000 plus tweets from the accounts that we monitor from China mentioning sanctions. We haven't coded them all, but I would say 90% of them that are editorialized are definitely negative. And probably the three main talking points there. One is hypocrisy. So saying, you know, the US has led all of these wars over the years. They've also committed, atrocities in places. They've encountered zero sanctions. So it is entirely hypocritical for the US and the West to now impose sanctions on Russia. The second sort of talking point speaks more to their efforts to divide. So saying sanctions are bad for Russia, of course they're bad for Russia, bad for Europe. So that, you know, America is not really being hurt by these sanctions. They're still importing some Russian gas. They're really hurting the Europeans. But that's also a global message too, saying that American sanctions are damaging the global economy. America's looking out for its own interests. They want to keep Russia down, but they're also doing it at the expense of the global community. So those have been the key talking points we've seen around sanctions since the war started coming from China.
Thank you very much, Bret. I see that everybody is nodding. So, Tauno, would you like to add a few things and a few 2 cents? I also would like to address to you another question from David Frey. Is there evidence that China sees the war in Ukraine as revitalizing democratic states in ways that threaten Chinese narratives about the inability of democratic governments to act quickly and effectively? To be able to address this as well, maybe. Over to you.
Yes, on the sanctions, yes. So I think most was said. Maybe just to also, when it comes to the sanctions and then what China says, of course, that they are illegitimate. But it's awfully interesting to see that and this, of course, characterizes a lot of Chinese communication, is that even in this case, it has been also EU taking sanctions against Russia. But if you look at the Chinese media again, then it all usually leads back to the US and EU. Either it's always the US sanctions, and EU is either, if it's mentioned that they are doing it because of the US to kind of to please or whatever the US. So yes, so it's kind of that the EU as such in Chinese communication often doesn't have agency itself. And when it comes to, yes, maybe one additional point is that sanctions are also always kind of portrayed also as an escalation of things. So it's kind of the West or the US kind of making things worse in terms of the war, rather than somehow reacting to Russia's activities. But then Ukraine and democracy. Looking at Chinese channels, we have not yet seen a strong kind of presence of or connection of democracy narratives that we have seen China pushing very strongly in general, and Ukraine, I think. So it remains to be seen whether these and in what form these will appear, because looking at what China has been saying about democracy previously, it is that they are trying to discredit Western liberal democracy and promote alternative models that we wouldn't actually call democracy as alternative forms of democracy, like their own system. So.
Thank you so much, Tauno. I would have another question to you coming from Natalie Kubert from Le Monde. And it's actually a very good one. Do you think that Russian and Chinese officials or heads of media groups actually kind of meet to discuss their narratives or somehow agree on them, on what are going to be their strategies, next steps? Has there been any data, I don't know, from secret services or intelligence anywhere which can say that this has been an issue? And also because, of course, our series of our events is dealing, of course, specifically with the Chinese disinformation in NATO countries. Would you also name, each of you, maybe the most outrageous, I don't know, narratives or disinformation posts by, or in terms within your area of research and study against NATO since the war started? This would be, Justyna, I would like to start, of course, with you, so that we can manage.
Well, I have no idea if there is any, let's say, communication line, hotline between, let's say, Putin and Xi Jinping. I have no idea. If I may, just one sentence about the sanctions, because yesterday during the MFA press conference, it was very interesting question about the sanctions, and it was openly said that, as Tauno and Bret mentioned, that United States are exerting pressure on the EU, that the EU impose sanctions on Russia. And of course, it is very good for the United States because United States have many benefits imposing sanctions on Russia, but it's a very, that many economic losses for the EU. And the best example is the influx of immigrants in, let's say, in Poland and Baltic states. So it is explicitly said yesterday that US sanctions and so China is trying to drive a wedge between, let's say, EU and the United States, because right now there's some kind of, let's say, unity between in this transatlantic unity when it comes to Russia and its aggression of Ukraine. And you asked me about, sorry for about the most, let's say, strange narrative when it comes to Chinese narrative about NATO countries. Well, recently I'm dealing with the Chinese, how China perceives the Central East European countries, and maybe not exactly about the NATO countries, but let's say about the CEE countries that are members of NATO and the EU, and we are called US pawns. Really, openly, official, maybe not officially, because I'm looking mostly on these Chinese experts, some text, but it's pretty open. I saw many sentences, many articles by Chinese officials that we are US pawns and here we are not independent. We do not speak in our own voice, that we are following what US is asking, or even we are anticipating what US would like to see, and we are behaving, maybe not waiting for, let's say, demands from orders from the United States, Washington. We are trying to anticipate. And the good example is Lithuanian decision to send COVID vaccines to Taiwan.
Bret, over to you.
Yeah, on the question of direct cooperation, that's been a question of debate for years, and I don't think there's ever been evidence necessarily that China Daily is calling up Margarita Simonyan at RT and they're aligning their narratives. I mean, there have been a few. There have definitely been cooperation agreements, but I think are largely symbolic between Russian state media and Chinese state media outlets, sort of content sharing agreements, but not at any level that they're sort of coordinating their messaging. So I think, like many of the media, frankly, like they're studying each other, they're picking up narratives, they're repeating them. So I think it happens slightly more organically, but I don't know. I mean, maybe there is some sort of back channel there, but I don't have evidence of that. And in terms of NATO, I would just agree with what others have said. NATO is depicted as a US organization that forces its will on Europeans. Europeans are always depicted, often in cartoons, essentially with the sort of Uncle Sam warmonger driving the tank and the European general in the little sidecar. as just sort of an unwitting partner in this relationship. But what's interesting is often the framing of NATO frames NATO as both a warmonger, but also as unreliable and somewhat feckless, and a partner not to be trusted. And I think that messaging is clearly directed at Taiwan and other Asia Pacific potential partners. And you've seen some of this direct connection, saying like US is trying to set up NATO in the Asia Pacific through AUKUS. And so we saw a cartoon that was shared by Chinese state media, Chinese officials, of essentially a drowning Ukrainian hand coming out of the water looking for NATO's help, and NATO essentially pulling the hand back or giving it a high five, I think was what it was, and then pulling it away. So there's this real message that like NATO should not be trusted as a partner, while also saying it is a warmonger and hypocritical and US led.
Thank you very much, Bret. And I would probably add one more question to Tauno, or perhaps this will be last remark for today. There is a question: what do you think? Do you think disinformation primarily serves China's domestic or international political interest? And what do you think is the domestic political consideration here? Perhaps you can. I think you can address this, Tauno, as well. Over to you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So on the China-Russia media cooperation, we fully agree with what Bret said, is that we see alignment, but that this is not necessarily evidence of coordination, and we have not yet seen evidence of actual coordination. On the question of disinformation. Yes, the purpose of disinformation. Well, it's always difficult to kind of to fully describe an intent of especially a huge country like China, because there might be parallel aims simultaneously. But of course, one has been that is also present in Chinese kind of statements and literature is increasing its discourse power. But indeed, ultimately, it has been also said by many that it all leads back to domestic stability and regime stability. But maybe just one more point actually to make is that especially when it comes to China and in general Chinese toolbox, one thing indeed is the question of disinformation or active promotion of messaging. But we see also what we see as concerning also is the aim to remove certain messages from the public sphere. The information suppression part, which is also which there are increasing number of media reports about, which ranges from intimidating individuals like individual activists, diaspora activists, for example, to then imposing economic repercussions on companies that have, for example, H&M that has expressed concern about human rights violations regarding Xinjiang cotton, and these are also significant in the sense that even, let's say, even if Chinese messages don't necessarily penetrate our information spheres, because we have quite then if there is kind of success in making us stop talking about certain things, then it has also had impact on our society. So when it comes to China, the toolbox is a little bit wider than only active promotion of certain messaging.
And in terms of the most ridiculous narrative, and also actually I have another small question to you. Who do you think is demonized more in Chinese media, EU or NATO? Or it depends on period of time?
I think that is quite clear. It is NATO. EU receives quite light and soft treatment in general, and I think when I lived in China now already a long time ago, but I remember that I actually had to explain that there is such thing as Europe that consists of 40 plus countries. Well, EU even is an even more obscure, I think, thing for many people in China. So NATO is definitely the more demonized, and also coming from a NATO country myself, that is located next to Russia. I think for me also the most kind of outrageous in the sense of not necessarily outrageous is indeed kind of the image of NATO coming and absorbing countries. That it's kind of again the agency question of I remember that for Estonia it was a clear long-term aim to join NATO. It wasn't like there was one day an organization coming and against our will taking us as their members. So for me this agency question is always the kind of in some ways the most outrageous.
Thank you very much. Teges, do you have 2 more minutes? I know Justyna has to run, but I saw you're kind of doing this. So do you agree with what Tauno said? And then I will let you go, and then I will have 2 more minutes to discuss with Bret and Tauno a few more things.
Yes, I agree that NATO is the biggest, let's say, threat, not EU. And to be frank, when I look at this situation in Ukraine, it is also sad that Ukraine, maybe not Ukraine on its own will, would like to be part of NATO. It is United States decided to, let's say, put Ukraine into the NATO. So Russia has no choice but to react. So I completely agree that EU has more softer face than NATO in Chinese eyes.
Thank you very much, Justyna, and I think we'll see each other. Thank you very much for this. Bret, so I want to ask you actually, both you and Tauno, because there have been a lot of questions regarding your research, and some people didn't hear properly what is Hamilton tool, what is your dashboard. So this will be your 2 minutes for each of you for self-promotion of your recent studies on Chinese and Russian disinformation, how it is happening and what is there. And also, Bret, in terms of your data, I want to ask you a similar question which I've just asked Justyna and Tauno. Who is the bigger evil in what you see in the data, the NATO or the US? If we speak about Chinese narratives. Thank you.
That's a harder question to answer because NATO is framed so much as driven by the US that it's tough to distinguish. But clearly the sort of American presence in NATO, I think, is what makes NATO a more demonized organization than the EU. I mean, almost everything about the US is negative. And so wherever the US has a footprint, the coverage is going to be extremely negative. But it's a really tough question to answer because I just can't kind of disentangle the two because the messaging is so similar about it, sort of US warmongering. To the question of our data, so our Hamilton tool is a publicly available dashboard. So anyone can go to our website and access it. It is updated several times a day. As I mentioned, it has roughly 1,000 accounts on Twitter from Russia, China, and Iran. And what this includes are all of their diplomats and government officials and embassy accounts, but also their main state media accounts and editors-in-chief and sort of key influencers through state media. So it aggregates essentially everything that we collect and pulls out key bits of information and puts them in the chart. So on any day you can go and see, okay, today China is talking about Taiwan more than Ukraine, more than the EU. But also here are the specific narratives, the hashtags that are being used, the accounts that are being retweeted, but we also allow users to go through the specific tweets. So you can run a targeted search. So if you want to see what they're talking about, Bucha, you just run Bucha and you'll see all the tweets there. So essentially it's an aggregation tool across, as I mentioned, Twitter. Facebook is sort of incorporated at this point, not entirely, but YouTube, state-sponsored websites, and then the MFA press briefings and official statements as well.
Tauno, your turn. Over to you.
I would start my opportunity also with a strong endorsement for Hamilton because it is indeed a useful tool. So fully support. But on our side, I would although not fully a China thing, I would still direct everybody to the EU versus Disinfo website, where we this Monday we also published an article on Chinese disinformation and narratives related to the Russia's aggression in Ukraine. And I have also published occasional articles highlighting the alignment between China's and Russia's narratives. A very short one. So.
Thank you so much. Bret, Tauno, Justyna is not with us at the moment, but I will thank her personally later. Thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you so much for sharing your fantastic and really overwhelming, I would say, knowledge. And thank you so much for great work, Alliance for Security and Democracy, and also European External Action Service Strategic Communication team are doing. I think it's extremely important. And from my side, as also a researcher on disinformation, I'd like to say that I think for the last 2-3 years, many people were saying, oh, we are fed up with this disinformation, why are you doing this? Oh, who needs this? And now we see what is happening. So let's also keep in mind that I think this topic, unfortunately, will stay relevant and will become probably even more important because of technology, and technology is not stopping, thankfully. And for all the audience, I would like to ask you to follow what is GMF doing, and I feel myself like I have I don't know, tons of questions to discuss with you and with your other colleagues, the speakers. So I hope we will be able to speak again. I think that it is important to keep an eye on what is happening in China media, in China officials. It's a big player, and we need to know what to expect from it, from the perspective of NATO, the EU, or other countries. I would like to thank GMF Warsaw office for putting this all together, for Alexandria also, who is on technical side, and of course for one more big thank for US mission to NATO, who gave us this opportunity to hold this series of webinars on Chinese disinformation. All three of them will be available on GMF YouTube. And please stay in tune. I hope we will continue our cooperation together. Thank you so much. Have a great evening. Have a great day, Bret. And I hope to see you soon somewhere. Stay safe. Bye-bye.